Ever since I've been in the world of online business, which is over 12 years now, passive income has been held up by everybody as the holy grail. It's the thing that everyone wants, that everyone's chasing. And indeed, I was for most of those 12 years. But as someone who has made tens of millions of dollars online, most of which passively, or what you classify as passive income, I can now say that I'm not a fan and I regret spending so many years chasing passive income. So in this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. In case you don't know me, my name is Olly Richards. I'm the founder of StoryLearning.com. It's a multi-million-dollar online education business. I'm also a mentor and advisor to other online education entrepreneurs. And right since the beginning of story learning, the early days back in 2013, the thing that I always wanted was passive income. And I think now when I look back, this is largely a reaction to what I was doing at the time, which is having a job that I didn't want, living in a country that I didn't want to live in, working for a boss who I didn't want to be my boss. So given those circumstances, it's kind of natural that I would react to that and want something that's purely passive. The idea of just making money while I sleep, traveling the world was very, very appealing. And there was a lot of talk about passive income at the time through affiliate marketing, SEO, these kind of things. And so I set about building my business as passively as possible. I didn't want any kind of active delivery. Everything in the business would be through digital products. We'd use traffic sources like affiliates, like search engine optimization, like podcasts, stuff that would just keep on giving and delivering traffic over and over and creating as passive a business as possible, largely fueled by email automation to make sales. And as the business progressed, I started to build a team around myself, and I got to the point where we were making 7 figures of annual profit, team running the whole thing. I hardly had to do anything. It was the most passive thing you could possibly imagine. And this is the thing about passive income. Despite building a business around passive income, there was never a point where we were all not working a lot. And the reason for this is that when you build a business through passive income, it is always reliant on algorithms of some kind. For example, we were very reliant on SEO in the early days, search engine optimization, so people looking for us on Google. And we were making 7 figures in revenue, largely driven by search engine optimization and then automated email funnels, digital products. But the problem with this is that in the back of your mind is always the question, well, what happens if something changes? What happens if this blog article stops ranking on page 1? What happens if this affiliate stops sending us traffic? What happens if we have email deliverability problems? You're permanently worried about changes in the algorithm and things stopping working. And this fundamental dynamic makes it so that you can never really be truly at peace when you're running this kind of business. Because the one constant in business, and especially in online business, is that things are changing all the time. One thing you can guarantee, things are going to change. So even if you get to a point where you're making 7 figures of revenue through digital products or affiliate offers, passive income, if you just sit there and assume that that's going to continue forever, then you are out of your mind, which means that you need to continually be changing, updating things, staying on top of algorithms, predicting the future and all of this. And so even a passive income-based business ends up being extremely active. And this is the experience that almost anyone that runs these kind of businesses will tell you, is that even though they built this passive income business, they are all working a lot. They're very active in their business because you're always building new things, trying out new things and reacting to changes that you do not control. You don't control the algorithm. You don't control what other people will do. You don't control email deliverability. What happened to me was I ended up in this place of quite a lot of anxiety because so much of my income and therefore my livelihood was dependent on algorithms that I didn't control. Amazon could suddenly stop ranking one of my books in the place that it had always been, and that would mean we would then make thousands of dollars less per month. These kind of things happen all the time. I imagine it's a little bit like being the dictator of a small country, the kind of all-powerful dictator with all the riches, all the palaces, a little bit like, I don't know, Saddam Hussein in the 90s. You have everything, and yet around every corner is an assassin lurking in the shadows. You never quite know who to trust. And so despite having everything, that ends up being a curse because you can never actually relax. Now, for a long time, I just thought this was normal because it was the only business model that I knew. But a few years ago, when I started my business brand, I got a taste for what business would be like when it becomes a lot more active. For years, I'd worked under the assumption that happiness for me as an entrepreneur would mean like everything being passive. So I wouldn't have to be involved in delivery. I wouldn't have to get on calls. And yet I found myself starting my business brand where everything was now very active. So I started buying ads to get my traffic. I started working with entrepreneurs one-to-one, actually being on Zoom calls, the thing that I never thought that I wanted, delivering live workshops and webinars for the audience on various different topics. Everything was suddenly very active. And it became a very different experience of life as an entrepreneur because I was now kind of adjacent to this area of time for money. The difference being that it was not very much time for a lot of money. So it wasn't exactly the same as working at McDonald's, but it was still this feeling of like, if I don't work, I don't make money. But then I started to think back to my experience growing story learning and realizing, well, the reality is we're always going to be working on something all the time anyway. And so it may as well be with something that's very profitable. But most importantly, something that you have control over. And this was the big difference with my business brand. Now, the traffic that was coming into the business was not dependent on any algorithms whatsoever. I was buying my traffic. If I wanted more traffic, I could just go and buy it, and it was great. So I didn't have any of the stress or anxiety over algorithms changing and suddenly scrapping all of my traffic. And then if I wanted to make money, I could take on a new client or release a new workshop. I felt like I was in direct control of all the moving pieces of the business, and it's a feeling that I never had. I mean, since the very beginning of story learning, over like 10 or 11 years ago, I haven't had that experience. And I ended up enjoying it so much more. Because if you leave aside for a moment the fact that one of these businesses was passive and the other one was active, in the round, I was working probably the same amount in each business, albeit on different things, and then making similar amounts of money. But I really noticed a big difference in my own sense of security and anxiety levels by simply being in control. And so in contrast to the rather tasteless Saddam Hussein example from earlier, it started to feel much more like, I don't know, some special highly valued merchant who would just travel from kingdom to kingdom and then maybe consult with the king for a while and then move on to do something different in another place. And always being the master of your own destiny and not being surrounded by this permanent sort of steady state of stuff that you don't control. Now these are two business examples, but of course there are other kinds of income that would typically be classified as passive. For example, you have bank interest and investments in index funds and things like that, which on the face of it are entirely passive. But even that is not really the case, because if you have money in the bank or if you have investments, you can't just sit there and not touch them for 20 years, because guess what? Things change. Interest rates go up or down. Markets shift. You always have to have some level of active monitoring. One of the things that I've done a lot of over the years with profits that have come from my business is invest in things like rental property and make angel investments in other startups. And I can tell you there's nothing passive about those things at all. With property, even when you have it actively managed by agents, there's still things to remember. You still have to make sure you have buildings insurance. There are always quotes for repairs that you have to approve. There's always something that's happening. And it's similar with angel investments. Like some of the best investments I've made have been angel investments in other startups. And it's fantastic. And it is very passive when you receive big dividend checks from these companies, but still it's not entirely passive because they have certain demands of you. They want input on something over here. They want a video or some work done over there. And there's always the questions like what's happening with the company's growth, like what's the right move strategically next. Again, all of these things take up real estate in your mind, and there's nothing passive about any of them. So I think the real flex with all of this is to understand that if you believe that you are a serious person who enjoys working on things and believes that you're always going to be working on something and that's going to make you a better person, then really it comes down to a question of how you want to spend your time. Because even with the most passive things of all, you're still going to have some of your time invested in that. And the real agency that we all have as business owners and as investors is to understand how we want to spend our time and arrange our various affairs so that we're spending time doing things that we really enjoy. Just like I quite enjoy sitting out here and making a video. But if you'd like to see how I built my new business brand up to 1.3 million in revenue with a 90% profit margin in this very non-passive active way, then check out this video over here that breaks down exactly how I did it.